Welcome to the Real Python Podcast. This is episode 25. Wouldn't it be nice to use a form of version control, but for data? Something that would allow you to track and version your datasets and models. Well, that's what the tool called DVC is designed to do. This week on the show, David Amos is here, and he's brought another batch of PyCoders Weekly articles and projects. David starts with a Real Python article titled Data Version Control with Python and DVC. We also cover several other articles and projects from the Python community, including where to get exposure to well-written code, delegation, composition, and inheritance, good Python project ideas for high school students, never running Python in your downloads folder, and more. We also have a special guest this week. I talked to Sadie Parker, who recently joined the Real Python team to help create and edit transcripts for all the Real Python video courses. We talk about how you can take advantage of all the features this new resource provides. Sadie also discusses how she uses Python to speed up and simplify the editing process. The transcripts and closed captions are now live on the website for all new courses, and we're working our way through the back catalog. All right, let's get started. The Real Python Podcast is a weekly conversation about using Python in the real world. My name is Christopher Bailey, your host. Each week, we feature interviews with experts in the community and discussions about the topics, articles, and courses found at realpython.com. After the podcast, join us and learn real-world Python skills with a community of experts at realpython.com. Hey, David, welcome back.
Hey, good to be back.
All right, so you cool with starting off this week with your first topic?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay.
So I've got a Real Python article by Christian Ivanchik. Hopefully I pronounced his name correctly. Christian has done a couple of articles. I'm not sure if this is his second article or third article for us now, but he had about a year or so since the last one. So he's come back and written this excellent article for us on data version control with Python and DVC. And it's a really cool project, this DVC, which stands for data version control. So data version control is a concept, right? Controlling version control for your data. DVC is the project name.
Okay.
It's written in Python. It's a Python. It's sort of like Git for data. And it's really, really cool. I think it solves a really interesting problem that I think a lot of people run into. I think that it's not uncommon for people, data scientists, people working in academia, to have your spreadsheets and your data just kind of all over the place. And, you have some weird version control of, maybe underscore date, whatever, some number at the end of your files. And you just kind of keep track of them that way. And it's a difficult way to sort of keep track of versions of your data set. You could use Git already to version control things, especially if you're working with like text files and
things that are small, right?
And things that are small.
Yeah.
If it's a small data set, then, Git can kind of take care of that for you. But as you start getting into the realm of larger and larger data sets, Git becomes troublesome for that. And it can be difficult to deal with that. So what DVC does is solve that problem. If you have a large data set that you need to keep track of, then DVC is an excellent choice for that. So Christian walks you through setting up a working environment using DVC and everything. And he walks through the workflow and kind of compares it to Git. And there's a lot of, I guess, crossover there. There's a lot of similarities between DVC and Git. So, for example, you can initialize a repository for DVC using DVC init, sort of like the Git init. And that, sets a few things up for you. So it creates a .dvc folder that holds all the configuration information. So this is just like the .git folder that Git does. And it sets up the repository for using the DVC. You can add data to a cache. So it works on like you have a local cache, basically, and then you would have like a remote file storage system. And the remote could be another folder on the same machine, or it could be an S3 bucket, or it could be just, anywhere, really. I mean, it's compatible with almost anything. You have some remote storage and a local cache. So that, again, that's very similar to the way Git works. But you've got a DVC add command that adds things to your local cache, sort of like Git add. It's kind of analogous to that. Although it's not quite the same. That DVC add does a little bit more. It not only says, hey, we need to track changes on this file. You add some file using DVC add and then file name or folder name or whatever. It says, okay, we're going to track changes on this, but it also puts it into that local cache for you already. So that's a little bit more than what git add might do. Then there's a DVC commit command, which is like git commit. If you have new changes to a tracked file, you commit those to your local cache. And then there's a DVC push to push whatever's in your cache to the remote storage. And then on the pooling side, getting data from remote storage, you've got a checkout command, a fetch command, a pull command that does like a fetch and then a checkout. So there's a lot of similarities between DVC and Git. Yeah, it's really targeted towards large data sets that need to have the data version controlled. And it just integrates really nicely with existing kind of Git workflows and everything. So Christian walks you through this whole workflow using sort of a pet project. So you build a machine learning model. It's nothing fancy. Honestly, he's just kind of got the code there for you. It's not, the model itself is not the point of the article. So it's really not trying to do anything fancy or get great accuracy or anything like that. It's just, kind of a quick and dirty thing to kind of get you going. But you've got an actual file that you can work with or an actual model that you can work with. You work on training it and then evaluating the performance and then getting that model and the data into version control. And he goes through some interesting ideas on, how you might work this in with a Git workflow. So for example, when you have a machine learning model, you do a bunch of like experiments, and the experiments might use different training data or maybe a different split or maybe just, different things that you want on the experiment, maybe a whole different data set. So he talks about one way you might do this is have different branches in Git per experiment. So he kind of walks you through a way to integrate all this with your Git workflow and have something that is easy to reproduce and share with people. He takes a deep dive into something called DVC files, which those are the text files that actually get committed to your Git repository. So your GitHub or GitLab or Bitbucket, whatever you're using. But these little DVC files contain like a pointer to the remote storage for your data. So instead of having to commit that large data, you're just committing this little tiny text file that has like a hash in it and some other information. And then another really cool thing about DVC really goes beyond the Git analogy is you can create these reproducible pipelines with it. So you can set up like what needs to happen for fetching the data, what needs to happen for preparing the data, what needs to happen for running the training, and then evaluating that training run. And you can stage all this stuff in a pipeline and use a DVC run command to run that pipeline. And then it's reproducible. The whole workflow is reproducible for everyone on your team or whoever you're sharing this with. So that's a really powerful feature that's really cool. So the article just, it walks you through all of this. Christian is a talented writer. I think he has a gift for explaining things really well. It's just a really enjoyable article to read. If you're in the data space, I definitely recommend checking this out.
I'm really kind of excited by the idea of it, especially the branching for your data. That sounds like that would be really helpful.
Yeah.
Especially, with a lot of the data science kind of things where you are trying different experiments or you're shifting from training data to other data and so forth.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. So my first one is a Reddit thread. It's titled Expanding Exposure to Good Code. And it's sort of this idea of like, where can you go out there to find well-written code and kind of learn from reading code? And this has been an ongoing topic that I've asked as a repeating question on the podcast. But this kind of goes a little bit further beyond necessarily going into reading Git repositories, which we've suggested in the past. It has a bunch of other resources that people suggested that kind of went in slightly different direction instead of saying, oh, go read the Flask documentation or go read the source code off GitHub. And they mentioned some resources that I wasn't familiar with. One is called Python Module of the Week, which I thought was kind of neat.
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah.
Yeah, it goes into depth on individual modules and kind of lets you kind of focus your attention. Like, okay, this and again, you can kind of pick and choose because it's been going on for quite a while. Subjects that you're interested in, and you can kind of use it as a checklist to kind of continue to build on your learning. There's a an algorithms implemented in Python Git repository that I think is really kind of neat too. One that I think I've heard before mentioned on a different podcast, probably Python Bytes, but it was something called Awesome Python Applications.
Oh, yeah.
Another GitHub repository. And this one is talking about actual applications that are out there in the world where the source code is something where you can go and read it, and they're organized by the type of application. So it could be, an audio player or a game or some kind of other web resource and so forth, where you can kind of learn, how did they structure this type of code for an existing, thing that's out there. And it's a really neat way to see not only, I guess one of those awesome lists, of like, okay, these were created in Python, and kind of give you an idea of what's happening with it.
Yeah, that's a really cool repo. I think the Talk Python to Me podcast actually had the author of that repo on to discuss that. So there's a whole podcast episode that
goes into it,
talks about some of the different projects. Yeah, but it's probably grown since then. So that's a fantastic resource for sure.
Yeah. So again, wanting to go and read and learn from them. And then someone else mentioned a YouTube video, which I started watching this morning just to kind of give heads up as I'm getting prepared for us to talk today. And the YouTube video is by James Powell. It's from 2017 PyData conference.
Mm-hmm.
And it's titled, So You Want to Be a Python Expert. And it starts off in a really interesting way, diving into sort of explaining dunder methods and, that kind of functionality. And it's done in a really well-structured way. He doesn't have any slides or anything. He's kind of working from memory as he's going through this list of, okay, as you create a class, what does this class need to do, and so forth. And it's really well presented, and it's almost 2 hours long. I didn't go all the way through it, but I'm excited to watch the rest of it. So I think it'll be a good resource to kind of take a different angle on the way of thinking of how to learn Python. He initially complained that he feels like a lot of books that are out there say, oh, here's something that that is a feature of Python, and then they go, and here's another feature of Python, here's another one, and so forth, but doesn't ever really get into the thinking that goes behind, in this case, this idea of data classes and how that relates to all these dunder methods that some people think of like magical methods for these things. But if you're creating and using object-oriented programming and creating these things, it's kind of vital to kind of think in this different way as you're creating them. And I felt like even within 20 minutes of me diving into it, that I was like, oh, okay, this is really tying together a lot of different thought processes, as I've been sort of immersing myself further and further into Python. I think it'll be really useful for a lot of people that are in that kind of intermediate stage.
Yeah, definitely.
Cool. So what's your next one?
Yeah, the next article I've got is by Leonardo Giordani, and it's about object-oriented programming in Python, specifically the topic of delegation. Before I talk about it, though, I want to kind of go back. He's got this whole series on object-oriented programming in Python that I think is really well done. It goes into a lot of depth, and it's also very approachable. I think he's got really good examples that he uses in the articles. They're very short, to the point, and sort of easy to digest, which is enormously helpful when you're trying to learn something like object-oriented programming, because it can be a lot to take in at first if you're kind of new to this whole concept. So having very concise, short examples is really helpful. But there's 3 pillars to object-oriented programming that he's going to expand on this whole series, and that is data encapsulation, delegation, and polymorphism. The article that we featured in PyCoders recently and that we're talking about today is on delegation. And it specifically talks about how you sort of assign tasks. That's kind of what the word delegation is, right? Like delegating something to something else. So it deals with these things, 2 concepts called composition and inheritance. And inheritance is when you have like a parent class and another child class that inherits from that. So you could have something like, I don't know, a vehicle class and then a car class that inherits from the vehicle class. And maybe, all vehicles have things like, I don't know, a make and a model, and maybe a type of engine or some sort of propulsion system, whatever it is that makes it go, right? And makes it
Sure.
a vehicle. And then the child class, a car, is going to have like a, very specific kind of engine, which could, I guess, be now like an electronic engine, or it could be a combustion engine or something like that. But the parent class is like a more general concept, usually of the child class. That's one type of way to sort of delegate things that the child class can use things that are defined in the parent class to work.
Yeah.
The other type of delegation would be composition, which is where rather than inheriting from something, you assign another object to like maybe an attribute on a class. So maybe you have some class that needs to incorporate logging and it needs some sort of logger. Well, rather than implementing the whole logger in this class, you can implement a logging class and then use a logger instance in that class to handle the logging. So it's then delegating the task of logging to this other logging class, or the instance of the logger that you've attributed to it when you create the instance of the class. But so this is the idea of delegation. How are you delegating different tasks around? And he talks about sort of 4 ways to look at delegation, and I'll just go through them fairly quickly. So one way to look at delegation is how you're sharing state. So in inheritance, a child class has access. The child class shares its whole state with the parent class. So it's like everything is just getting absorbed completely. So that's one way. In composition, you're like picking and choosing which pieces of state kind of get shared. Like you're passing something into a method on the class that's being composed. So you're not sharing all of your state. You're just like whatever you are comfortable giving to it, basically. So this is the idea of sharing state in these. The other thing is about control. So he says another way to look at the dichotomy between inheritance and composition is that of the control we have over the process. So there's an idea of control. There's also relationship between two things. So the way he describes this, I think, is really good. Is it to be versus to have? So in the inheritance type of delegation, it's the to be kind of relationship. A car is a type of vehicle.
Right.
But in the composition, it's a to have relationship, right? A car has an engine. So maybe, you have a combustion engine class or a electric engine class. So that's another way to think of the difference between these two: to be versus to have.
Kind of composing of parts and
exactly,
functionality. Okay.
And then also the different kinds of entities that are involved in the different kind of delegation. So in inheritance, you're dealing mainly with classes. You're inheriting from some parent class, whereas in composition, you're dealing with like instances of other kinds of classes. So you're assigning some instance to that class that you're creating. So he just really goes into the different kinds of delegation, inheritance versus composition. I think it's a really critical part of understanding object-oriented programming and sort of getting your head around like when should you use inheritance versus composition. And most experienced programmers are going to prefer composition over inheritance whenever possible. It's sort of the safest route. It's kind of makes the most sense in most cases, but you need to know when to use it, when to not. So he gives some pointers in this. He calls the section bad signs, but he says you're incorrectly using inheritance when there's a clash between attributes with the same name and different meanings, or you feel the need to remove methods from the child class. You're incorrectly using composition when you have to map too many methods from the container class to the contained one, or you're composing instances but creating many class methods so that the container can access them. So it gives you some idea of when you might be doing it wrong. I think that actually is kind of a good approach to teaching it, because it's sort of like, it's hard to know when to do it. So it's good to have an idea of when not to do it.
Right.
I guess, right? It's kind of easier to know,
I know you're traveling down the wrong path.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's sort of easier to spot like, oh, you start doing it. Oh, no, this is not looking good. I probably need to rethink the way that I'm doing this. But anyways, it's a really in-depth article with lots of examples. And then this whole series is quite long. He's got several articles in the series about object-oriented programming, and even some videos that he's published to YouTube. So he talks about types and classes and how to create a class, classes and instances, those are all the parts before this part 5 delegation. So if you're new to OOP, you might want to check that out before you get into this one. But honestly, I feel like if you've already got the basics of OOP down, you understand the difference between classes and instances and things like that, then jumping into this article is not going to be too difficult.
Sounds like it's trying to give you lots of examples. Like I like the example they have that he created in there, the one with the windows, sort of like it kind of goes to like GUI stuff if you ever used a GUI framework.
Right.
And how very often are inheriting a lot of things. Like, okay, this is a button. Okay, but this one inherits from this general idea of button, but it has a text field inside of it too. It's like a submission button or some kind of other thing that's kind of building on top of it. And so that makes sense to inherit it that way. Or he uses the example of a window versus like a transparent window. It's still going to have, resizing methods and,
Right.
information methods and all these things that you feel like every instance of a window should have these things. And that makes sense for that type of path. But I can see how you can really start down the wrong path pretty quickly, if you kind of jump down one of these methodologies and you kind of tie yourself in knots trying to fix it all and overriding everything. And
yeah, it's, inheritance is one of those things, especially that can get real tricky. You develop this hierarchy when you create, parent classes and child classes of other child classes, and it can get really deep and nested. And then it becomes really difficult to reason about what your code is doing and where things are actually happening and what's going on. So it's good to know when it makes the most sense to use it, but you also want to know when you might be time to sort of rethink how you're doing stuff. So
yeah, definitely. My next one is another Reddit thread. And I thought it was kind of interesting because we've been focusing a lot on our episodes of having projects at the end of them.
Yeah.
And the idea of this thread was, okay, what are some good Python project ideas for high school students? Now, there's a caveat because it's got a long kind of initial introduction to it. It's like, okay, well, who are we talking about? Okay, well, generally high school students might think one way or another. But in this particular case, he's saying, okay, I have, divide them up into teams and they're going to have, I have an overall number of 10 individuals. But mostly, I think the core thing that a lot of people missed in it is that these are students that have expressed interest in continuing on in their programming education at a university, potentially in CS or a related field. And so he wants some additional skills to be gathered through doing this. So sending them off to, do something that doesn't really kind of, he wants it to, I think any kind of project is going to help you build your skills. But I think there's different types of projects that will help you kind of think about, okay, well, do they need to learn about Git and doing source control? Do they need to learn a little bit more about working with an API? Is it something that would be useful to kind of dive into? And so I thought a lot of them, one of them that I always have liked is a text adventure.
Yeah.
Because it kind of builds on top of the idea of object-oriented programming in kind of a fun way. You are sort of integrating functions and loops and conditionals and those sort of things. And it doesn't always have to go down the route of it being like some kind of D&D kind of style thing. I've heard text adventures be everything from like something that's happening with spies, or could be, something that's happening with the Wild West, or, whatever you want to think of. Like just kind of think of some kind of adventure that somebody could go down the lines of and then modeling the real world. It could be anything you want to create. So you have to kind of maybe give some extra parameters there. And also, I felt that way about creating games, having to manage all the different assets and so forth.
Yeah.
Getting into a visual one kind of gets a little more advanced. Something like Pygame or something like that, you definitely need to think beyond like simple like characters and so forth. But in general, I think it's good to start there. One of the main other suggestions was about visualizations and working with data. Again, if you have some people that express interest in that kind of thing, like they're interested in science and not necessarily purely CS, then I definitely see that, creating projects around that. And there's so many great data sets. We've talked about that before, but things like Kaggle that can provide really good resources to get people started on that. But then it got into like, creating a jukebox, some kind of audio player, and that could lead them to learning about GUIs, to learning about handling files, and kind of all the different sort of interactions, and potentially, thinking about user interaction and having to work from there. I think things like CircuitPython are great for beginners. And the thing that it's sort of missing is potentially the whole source control kind of thing. You do get this sort of great interaction in working with hardware and building physical projects. And I think that's truly exciting. Maybe tying that in to, an API or working with like a website or kind of like, having that physical thing that's out there and having it interact and seeing its actions, but maybe having some kind of way of it tying into data might be even more useful, that somebody else could like, oh, I want to look at this website and see, the results of, what's going on with, this automation system I set up, or this, sensor I have for soil or light or moisture or something like that.
Yeah.
And so I think all that's really useful. And then, just building a website these days, like if you look at the tutorials for things like Django Girls, you're diving pretty deep in building a website with like a framework like that, building like a blog engine with something like Django, and it leads even to like, testing and stuff like that. So yeah, it has a lot. It's a huge thread.
Yeah, it is.
And I think it has a lot of really good things that are, not only useful for high school students, but, again, for those of us who are intermediate developers that want to have projects to kind of mess with, and web scrapers and bots, things like that. And you can find a lot of additional fodder for your own projects there, hopefully.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I decided to include it in PyCoders. Is I've just felt like when I was reading through that thread, I was like, this is not just good for high school students. Like, this is good for anyone that's a beginner to, early intermediate Python developer. So yeah, there's lots of interesting ideas there. So if you're looking for a project and need inspiration,
yeah,
it's a good thread to peruse.
Definitely. This week, I want to shine a spotlight on another real Python video course. It covers a function that can help when you're working with multiple iterables in Python. It's titled Parallel Iteration with Python Zip Function. The course is based on a real Python article by Leodanas Pozo Ramos. In the course, instructor Liam Pulsifer takes you through how to use the Python zip function for parallel iteration, how to create dictionaries on the fly using zip, how to sort multiple intervals, and more. I think it's a worthy investment of your time to learn the zip function and start wrangling multiple iterables to solve real-world problems. And like most of the video courses on Real Python, the course is broken into easily consumable sections, and you get code examples for the techniques shown. Check out the video course. You can find a link in the show notes, or you can find it using the newly enhanced search tool on realpython.com. All right, what's up next?
The next one I got is called Never Run Python in Your Downloads folder. And this comes from Glyph Lefkowitz, who's the creator of the Twisted framework. This article on, what happens or what bad things can happen when you run Python in your downloads folder. I'm going to just go ahead and say I've never run Python in my downloads folder, and I don't know if that's something that some people do or not. But I think the point of the article, though, is not so much that it's like focusing on the downloads folder specifically, although he does mention an exploit that can happen that specifically targets the downloads folder. And I guess what prompted this. But really, it's about understanding what happens when you execute Python, and what things are trusted and what things aren't trusted. And this could happen, it pertains not just to the downloads folder, to wherever you're running Python. It's good to know what really happens. And so he starts off saying Python needs a safe space to load code from.
Yeah.
And there are 3 critical assumptions embedded in Python's security model. Every entry on sys.path is assumed to be a secure location from which it is safe to execute arbitrary code. The directory where the main script is located is always on sys.path. That's kind of a key thing there. When invoking Python directly, the current directory is treated as the main script location, even when passing the -c or -m options. So these are the 3 key things to keep in mind. And again, it's not just about the downloads folder, it's about any folder you're in. When you run Python and then execute some script, whatever the current working directory is, anything in there is fair game. It's just going to say, if you're trying to run some other file in here, I'm just going to trust that it's safe and I'm just going to do it.
Yeah.
And that's really the key thing to take away from this article. And I think that it's something that for some reason gets overlooked when people are learning Python. It's something that I have to admit, it took me a while to sort of understand how this actually worked in Python, or what was going on. Honestly, the idea of running arbitrary code felt a little odd to me at first, and was like, wait a second, it does what? Like, it's just gonna run that code in there? Like, okay, well, that's good to know now. That's I need to take those things into consideration. But yeah, it's something that I feel like it's overlooked a lot for beginners. And this also plays into something that I've made the mistake of doing. It's actually how I ended up learning that this was a thing. And I've seen other people have this issue as well. And it's when you are trying to use, say, a module in the standard library, but you have in your current working directory, or maybe even the file you're trying to run is named, has the same name as the module you're trying to
Right.
import. So,
You
like,
get collisions and stuff like that.
well, what happens? Like, let's say you have a file called math.py in your
Okay.
directory, and you've defined a couple of little math functions in there or something, and in another script, you open up, you say, I need to use, I don't know, the pi constant from math. So you import math and then try to use math.py, and you might get an error saying there's no, you get a name error. There's nothing
Right.
in math called math.py, because it's importing your math module that's in your directory and not the one from the standard library. So there's like this precedence, right, of what happens where and what gets loaded first. So that can be surprising. I think another thing that's surprising is when people, they download, I don't know, maybe they have well, we could use the same math example. There you have a math.py file. It's your main script, and then you import math into it from the standard library. Well, now you're going to get import errors because it's like just all sorts of weird stuff is going on. So you get some strange stuff happening. And when people run into this, it's super confusing, but it all boils down to the way that where Python is looking for things, and the fact that, hey, there's an order, and that current working directory, or the directory where your main script is located, those are going to get put onto path, and it's going to have a higher precedence than, say, something in the standard library. And so one of the, I guess, bad things that can happen with this, that can actually be bad, is there's this category of attacks called DLL planting. And that's where certain browsers can be tricked into putting files with arbitrary file names into the downloads folder without any interaction from you while you're browsing. And say, for example, you're on a website and there's this DLL planting attack occurs, and it puts a pip.py file in your downloads folder. And that pip.py file does something really bad. I don't know, it steals some data, or it deletes your hard drive, or I don't know, it does something terrible. Well, if you're in your downloads folder and you go to check something and you go, okay, python-m pip install whatever. Well, you're just telling Python to run the pip.py file that's in your downloads folder.
Because it's going to find that first.
Because it's going to find that first. It's in the current working directory, and you're running it python-m pip. You're running it as a module. So it's going to say, okay, oh, look, I found this pip.py. Before it ever even tries to go to the actual pip, I found this pip.py, and it's just going to execute it because it's going to assume that it's safe. And then whatever is in that pip.py, it's going to happen. Your hard drive's going to get wiped out. Your data's going to get stolen. Something bad is going to happen. So that's the article. Never run Python in your downloads folder. It's a catchy title, but really the important thing in this article is just knowing what happens when you run Python and how it treats code. That, if it's in your current working directory, it's fair game. Whatever it is, it's going to run. It's going to assume that it's safe.
Kind of goes back to that idea of names are hard, but using these really generic names for things. Again, that's a theme that I've heard the guys on Python Bytes talk about, not using utils.
Right.
But
Yeah.
this whole idea of like creating a proper name and thinking about the namespaces of okay, what exists. It even goes back to keywords, right? Like this idea that understanding structurally as a beginner or an intermediate Python person, like these are things that are pretty big pitfalls that you can fall in with not realizing it. I've seen people create a request.py file or something like that,
Exactly.
because that's what they're doing, and it's like, well, okay, but
Yeah.
now you've renamed something that you're importing, and and so you're getting this whole like collision of so forth, and so I haven't seen anybody say, okay, this is the best solution, but the idea is like, okay, come up with unique names for your code that is going to be run first, right? It has that higher priority, so that it definitely. What's it say in the Zen of Python? Here it is. Namespaces are one honkin' great idea. Let's do more of those.
Exactly. Yeah.
Cool. So I guess that leads us to talking a little bit about projects. So the project I want to talk about is called Present. And it's a presentation tool, kind of like allowing you to do slides inside of the terminal. So it's a terminal-based presentation tool with colors and effects. You can play these pre-recorded code blocks called a codio, and that allows you to show off, you as you're working through steps inside of programming if you wanted to. It uses Markdown, so you just save a simple .md Markdown file. So that includes, the standard Markdown things for headers, the normal things for inline code, links, quoting, lists. But you can also just indicate the change to another slide instead of having a separate file. You just put 3 dashes in a row, and those 3 dashes indicate moving on to the next slide. And then along with the codios and the other things I mentioned, you can have styling for the background and the foreground colors. And then there's also the ability to put these slides with effects on them. And the effects are all done in ASCII, which is really kind of cool looking, of fireworks or explosions or a version of like the Matrix kind of coming down. It's pretty slick. And so it's a neat way just to, if you wanted to do a talk and do a quick set of slides for it, you could do that all inside of this terminal tool, all written in Python. Uses another Python library called Aschematics. So check it out. So what do you got for a project?
Yeah, this is a fun one. It's a mini Raspberry Pi Boston Dynamics inspired robot. The creator calls this the Spot Micro. So I don't know if you're listening, if you've seen this, Boston Dynamics, they've created this like robot dog that I guess has applications in things like security and maybe even like military or things like that. But it's this, I don't know if you'd really call it cute, the actual like robot dog. The micro dog is actually kind of cute. The big one is sort of terrifying, actually, in a lot of ways. But
depending on what they have it running out there and doing, yeah,
exactly. But cool nonetheless. I mean, it's a huge feat in robotics. So this project is taking a Raspberry Pi 3, some servos, an LCD panel, and Thingiverse 3D printed Spot micro frame. So that's, you can actually buy this 3D printed frame that like all this goes into, and building a controllable robot out of this that mimics the Boston Dynamics Spot robot dog. So the code is written in C++ and Python, and there's a GitHub repository that's got all the code in it, as well as like very detailed instructions on setting everything up, as well as some ideas for like future work to expand on the project.
Yeah.
Like incorporating LiDAR, developing autonomous motion, incorporating a camera or webcam, so they could do like basic image classification and things like that. So yeah, there's a lot of things to expand on here, and it just looks like it'd be a really fun project to build, over I don't know if it'd be a weekend project for, maybe if you're really good with hardware and really, for me, this would probably be like, a month of probably fooling around every weekend to get something. But there's a cool video. It was featured in the Raspberry Pi blog.
Okay.
And that's the article that we've linked to in PyCoders. But there's a cool YouTube video they've got in that article that's got, the demo. He's in his living room, and he's got it walking around, and he's controlling it from his laptop. So I took a little bit of a browse through the code, and it looks like most of the control API is in Python.
Okay.
Whereas a lot of the actual, I guess, like the hardware control, like what's actually controlling the hardware, most of that is in C++. But then the actual, where you're orchestrating things and sending it commands, a lot of that is in Python. So it's also a cool project then, I guess, to see those two languages integrated with each other, right? Like you've got those things talking and everything. So yeah, just a really fun project. If I had a lot of free time, I would love to tackle this one.
Yeah, I wonder what the price of the parts and stuff. The Raspberry Pi, I can imagine, is pretty inexpensive, but I've never bought any robot other parts and so forth, motors and servos and things like that.
Yeah, that's a good question. My guess is most of it is pretty reasonable.
Okay, because of its size.
Because of the size and everything. And the 3D printed thing, I guess it's free to download. Yeah, it's free to download all the files, but then you would need access to a 3D printer and the materials to actually go print this, which I think, a lot of public libraries nowadays have some stuff like that.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
And I think there's like maker spaces, and if you're in a larger city, you can usually find somewhere that they'll have the material, and you just pay for the material and some time to go use the machine. So depending on where you are, I guess that's a big part of it. Like if you're located in a big city, then you probably actually have fairly easy access to a 3D printer. Although I don't know how that works in the time of coronavirus. Maybe there's that makes it a little bit more difficult. But yeah, it just looks like a really fun project.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for coming on the show again.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right. Talk to you soon.
See you later.
Next up, it's my conversation with Sadie Parker about creating transcripts for RealPython's video courses. We discuss how you can take advantage of all the features and functions these transcripts and closed captions provide. And we also talk a little bit about how she's using Python in the process of editing and creating these transcripts. So here's that conversation. Hi, Sadie. I wanted to welcome you to the podcast.
Hi, Chris. Thanks. Happy to be here.
It's really cool to have you coming on not only the show, but also to come on the team to help us with, creating these transcripts for RealPython. Maybe you could give us a little idea of what the project entails and what you've been doing.
Yeah, sure. So it's honestly been like quite an honor to work on these transcripts and captions. I mean, RealPython is like a really great resource for me. I do some learning of Python on the side of my other projects, and so it's always been something in my peripheral vision for the past couple years, and it's really fun to work on some of this video content.
Yeah.
And yeah, I started with you guys about, is it like a month and a half ago now?
Yeah.
Yeah, we've been plugging away at the existing video courses. There's a lot, and we've been...
Yeah, about a year and a half of them, so...
Yeah, we've been, I think, handling transcripts for new courses really well, and everything's going smoothly. It's fun.
Yeah. So I wanted to maybe go through questions people might have about them, or like reasons, like, I guess maybe the first one to start with would be, why is RealPython adding transcripts to the video?
Yeah. So I think first off, it just adds a lot of value, and it makes the video courses a ton more accessible. It definitely helps with searchability and findability for the courses and for specific course content inside each course. So that's really cool. I don't know, but what I heard was that from you guys is that there was quite a lot of requests for transcripts and captions just because of how much it aids with learning.
Yeah.
When watching video courses.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of dive into a couple of those things there. So the accessibility part, again, I think kind of getting this feedback through channels from Dan, he was saying that multiple people had requested, partly it could be they wanted to use this visual medium, but they couldn't hear the instructor speaking, but now having the words there along with it as closed captions. And then also, it's really kind of neat. The whole transcript is contained below each of the videos there that somebody can kind of go through and just read through what's happening. So there's an accessibility thing for, again, somebody who can't necessarily hear those things, but also if somebody wanted to go back and, what did that person say?
Mm-hmm.
It can actually go and look through all the stuff that's happening there. Or if your English isn't your first language, somebody can kind of look through it. And I think that is huge for the accessibility.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then one of the other things I was thinking about that you said there is you said searchability. How has that changed, like with having the transcripts?
So now that there's like transcripts below each video course, or the ones that are coming out, it makes it quite possible, I believe, to search the site with the keywords of what you're hoping to learn about. And videos that specifically mention that specific topic will show up in the search results, and it'll also more easily show up in Google search results. And another part just within the courses themselves, like if you'd like to skip forward to a particular part in a video, if there's just one topic you're hoping to zoom in on.
Right. Something you're stuck on.
Right. Yeah. You can just head over to that particular subsection on that video course, and like what I would use would be Control F and just look for those words, and you can click on the transcript and it'll bring you right to that time in the video. So that's really helpful.
Yeah, I think that kind of brings us to that idea of the navigation part of it. That is kind of a neat feature inside of it. It's not a static set of words that's on the page. They actually interact with the video itself, acting as a way that you can, if you use that search functionality, if you see a sentence that, say maybe you're looking at something about lists or something like that, and there was a particular method that was mentioned and you search for that method, you'll see the full sentence. And as you click on it, it jumps to that section of the video and repeats that whole sentence. And so it's a way of navigating very quickly.
Yeah, really helpful.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really useful for learning. And then the other feature that's added with that is that that's a link, right? So that you can actually share, because you've actually done it for me. I've asked you to since I'm working on the video courses, you've been able to say, okay, this person's mentioning a link here. And so I've been adding in this other section of the text that goes below the videos, this area called the description. If there are links that the video instructor mentions, I can then, you're like giving me this highlight, and it's like literally like time code almost, like exactly where in the video I need to go look for it.
Yeah, those links are really helpful. They've been super helpful for me, like in trying to standardize kind of the syntax and the formatting for these transcripts, like in asking for feedback from the rest of the team. Like those links are very helpful for just getting everybody's eyes on one portion and trying to decide together what's both the most readable and the most accurate way to transcribe this particular idea, so that it's, both reflecting the instructor's intent and accurate to the course content and emphasizing, the main ideas behind the course. Yeah, I love those links. They're really nice.
Yeah, I thought about maybe we could talk a little bit about the process that you're using. There's this whole extra layer, and partly of what your work is, of taking what's being automatically generated and then making sure that it's correct.
Yeah.
Is that a big part of what you're doing?
Yeah. So we get these auto-generated transcripts from Rev AI, and they're really good, especially non-technical speech. They're quite accurate as far as word content.
Yeah.
And then what comes after that is just going through and making sure that for the non-technical bits, just making sure that the punctuation accurately represents what's being said, so that if you don't hear the audio, you're getting the right meaning from the words that are there.
Yeah.
And then for the more technical parts, we're going through and making sure that when a particular verb is a function, that we're making sure to represent that it's a function. When a object is an object, we're going with the real Python formatting standards and making sure it's being represented as an object, because the words behind Python and behind programming of objects and methods and variable names and everything, they exist within like English syntax, but they also touch on ideas specific to programming. So it's pretty important to make sure that we're representing that in the transcript, so that they are helpful and like as good a learning resource as possible. So yeah, a lot of work goes into that, just making sure that that's accurate.
Yeah, I can tell like the amount of kind of back and forths over the last, month or so of like, okay, well, this is how I think it should be represented, as code. This is what I think will make the most sense as far as like what the instructor's trying to pinpoint, and having to kind of even bring those people in to say, okay, yes, is this what you meant? And again, most of the video courses are built based upon articles. There's some research that can happen there, but very often the instructor's adding new content or adding new concepts to it. So it's kind of, a whole team of people that you have to kind of rope and wrangle to make sure that this is, coming across as the point that it's going to make the most sense to the person reading those transcripts as they're moving along. So as you start this process, what are the tools that you're using, and what's the process that you're taking to create these?
Yeah, so we start off with these VTT files, and basically we're just comparing it against the video and audio that they were generated against. And to speed up the editing process and keep everything consistent, I've got some different little macros and workflows for the most commonly replaced words or the most commonly misrepresented words from the auto-generated ones.
That's nice.
Yeah, it's fun. It's actually really fun. It's probably one of my more favorite parts of the process, just going through the transcripts afterwards and checking to see, like, what did we change this time? And sometimes you find some pretty funny auto-generated words in there that really just don't belong in a technical tutorial.
Yeah.
So it's fun to pick those out and make sure that, they don't get by next time. But yeah, for those steps, I'm using the Python regex package. I don't know if it's pronounced re or re, but that goes through and does a bunch of substitutions for me on the VTT files. And then I've got a couple little, I do the actual caption file editing in Sublime, because there's some really helpful little snippets and plugins I have in there for making sure that vocab is consistent and speeding up any commonly used words. So yeah, it's a fun process. It's enjoyable.
That's cool that you're using Python to to edit these things. That's very cool.
Yeah, it's fun. There's the fun thing about transcription is that there really are a lot of open source projects around transcription and captioning, because it is such a technical process and people are always trying to speed it up. So there's a really nice little community online working on transcription and captioning outside of the big guys doing the auto-generated caption stuff.
Yeah, I can imagine that. I mean, there's this whole field in data science of looking at text. The world has shifted to so much video and audio resources. So I can imagine that being able to get your hands on the text part of it is pretty crucial. So that's neat. Is there a particular package you'd want to share?
Well, there's a couple Python packages that I haven't used on this project. There's PyCert is one package. There's another one just called Cert, SRT, it's a popular subtitle file type. And there's WebVTT for these VTT files.
Okay.
Yeah, those are mainly just for parsing the files and changing them into different formats.
Nice. Yeah, it's an interesting, VTT is an interesting format because it has the sort of the time code sort of above it. It's mainly a text file, but it has this very specific ways that the video has been broken down, and I could see it needing to make sure that you don't break that format as you apply it. So
yeah, it really doesn't like being broken. There's a whole little history of these types of files, and I think people like VTT the best. I think it's the most elegant one we've got so far.
Okay. And again, I don't think we mentioned it, but the kind of the how of like how somebody can use these, every new course that's coming out from us, every brand new video course has these already ready to go in them, and you can access them just right below the video. There'll be a tab that says transcript, and then also the video player has a closed caption button, and the captions will appear right below the video inside there, but it's something you can kind of turn on and off. I like how the captions move up and down a little bit if you move your hand toward the controls. So in general, they're keeping the captions at the bottom set of the screen.
Yeah, exactly. And then also, I think that there's a setting you can go to your profile settings and make sure that if captions are available for that video, they'll automatically be turned on.
Yeah.
Which is also pretty helpful.
Again, even if you're not, say you are a native English speaker, in that particular case, then you may want to watch something quicker. I've done that before. I definitely listen to podcasts faster and other types of audio content. And so sometimes you may want to speed things up, and the captions could potentially help you absorb some of that faster. Or it could be the reverse, and it, again, depending on your fluency, it's something that you can kind of use and repeat. And I think it's just going to really help with learning in general.
Mm-hmm. This is kind of unrelated, but a friend of mine was talking about how they use this subtitle plugin. Maybe it's with Netflix, I'm not sure, but it's kind of like it's a foreign language learning aids.
Okay.
It gives you like your native language and also the language you're trying to learn. It gives you the subtitle for both of those, which sounds really cool.
Oh, stacks them somehow?
I think so. That's what they said. But what I'm trying to get at is just, I think subtitles are like really helpful for learning language, and then also just, getting a better idea of what the content is.
So here you're potentially learning two languages, right? It could be that English is not your standard language. And the second could be, hey, I'm trying to immerse myself in Python. And so, which is something I'm kind of on a theme with. I have an interview with Michael Kennedy coming up, and we talk a little bit about that idea of using podcasts and other mediums and things like that to sort of immerse yourself into learning a language, in this case, Python.
Interesting. Yeah. When you think about it, like learning Python at all, like all the programming languages that I've been like exposed to are all very English centric. So just learning a programming language is kind of immersing yourself in English. It's pretty crazy to think about. Which I think, it's something I was thinking about today when Dan and I talked like a month and a half ago about transcripts and like future goals of the captions. He mentioned a dream of having some, foreign language captions for these subtitles as well one day, which would be really cool. And I was thinking about today about, just how we are treating Python in these transcripts versus, non-programming language.
Yeah.
And we are formatting it differently, which is kind of not exactly standard for captions and subtitles in general, even for technical videos. But I was thinking how helpful that would be for foreign language translations, making sure that the Python itself is, wrapped in its own code blocks to make sure that any sort of auto translation isn't translating those variable names as well. It's really cool.
Yeah, it would know like where not to step as it kind of as it parses through that. That's pretty cool. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. I hope that's something that we can add. This is a free upgrade, I guess, for everyone who has a video subscription account. And even if you're, just perusing through Real Python, you can see the transcripts to get an idea of if that's something that you're interested in and getting a subscription. So I think it's going to be a nice way to add it. And I think we were just trying to do the numbers here that we have 10 of the newer courses already done, and then going back into the back catalog. And so it's approaching about 20 courses at the time of this recording that will have transcripts ready to go, which is really cool. And of course, you're working hard on them, and I'm reviewing and trying to stay up to date with what you're finishing as we keep going along.
Yeah, there's a whole pipeline on top of your pre-existing video production pipeline.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but I'm excited to do it. I'm excited about the feature. And I want to hear from people that they want to provide feedback about it. Please let us know what you think and how, if you're using them in a kind of interesting way, that would be really neat to hear too. But it's something that we're excited about, and we're feeling like it's going to help us create better content all the time.
Yeah. Feedback would be great. Like if anybody has any thoughts on the transcripts, or if anybody notices anything that's ambiguous or inconsistent, like leaving comments on the site where you would normally leave it on the course is going to be really helpful. Or, just, I believe there's some submit feedback buttons as well that people could use.
Yeah. And I know that taking those extra steps of actually editing what's getting automatically generated is really helping with the understandability and focusing the elements that are code, the different ways that people colloquially mention different features inside of stuff. Things like you may have always just seen it in print and never necessarily heard it pronounced before. Things like API or
GUI,
dunder methods, or all these kinds of weird things that people have out there that you hear inside of Python that are specific to the language.
Yeah, pretty fun.
Yeah. Well, thanks for coming on the show and talking to me about this stuff, and hopefully hear from you again for another update soon.
Yeah, that would be fun. Thanks, Chris.
I want to thank David Amos and Sadie Parker for coming on the show this week. And I want to thank you for listening to the Real Python podcast. make sure you subscribe to the podcast in your favorite player. And if you like the show, leave us a 5-star rating and a review. You can find show notes with links to all the topics we spoke about inside your podcast player or at realpython.com/podcast. And while you're there, you can leave us a question or a topic idea. I've been your host, Christopher Bailey, and look forward to talking to you soon.